Well, Palworld has finally fully released with its 1.0 update, and I've been playing a decent amount, so I was curious myself, how does it run on the Steam Deck? Especially since this game is only on the current generation of consoles, and the deck is more in line with last generation performance. The game is officially verified on the platform by Valve, but I feel like the program is losing credibility a bit, with some pretty bad experiences being labeled as verified, like Spider-Man 2 and Ark Survival Ascended. So let's take a look at performance, my personal recommended settings, and then we'll play around a bit with the addition of FSR4 and frame generation. So let's just get to it. First of all, I'm on the LCD model of the Steam Deck, running the stable branch of SteamOS, which is currently on version 3.8.16. And as you can see here, I'm also running it through the default Proton layer chosen by Valve, so Proton 10. These first few clips are on the non-DX12 version, so DX11, which I'll comment on a bit later in the recommended settings portion of this video. Anyways, upon launch, the game defaults to the very low preset. If you're just on the menu, it will show no anti-aliasing, but once you're in a world, it will switch to TSR, or at least it did in my testing. I'm just in the first little mountainy area here, and the game doesn't look great by any means, with shadows completely missing and such. But hey, at least it's running pretty well. You could easily cap this at like 45 to 50 FPS and get a pretty smooth experience in these general scenarios. You may notice some frame time spikes, which show themselves as stutters throughout gameplay, but it's far better than what I expected, to be honest. We are being CPU limited here, so we're hitting the bounds of what we can hope for on the deck in this game specifically. And as we pass by my base, it's admittedly pretty small with only a handful of pals, so why don't we switch to something a little bit more late game. I'm going to be using this save file found on Nexus Mods, so thank you to the owner for publishing this because it makes my life so much easier. So here is a more medium-sized base with a lot more pals active in comparison, complete with visual effects surrounding the player. This is much more representative of the frame rate in the later parts of the game, or if you're playing the game in servers with pre-established player bases. The pals are causing a pretty heavy CPU bottleneck, dropping the frame rate to around 25-ish here. Because we're so CPU bottlenecked, we're going to try increasing the settings somewhat for a more visually pleasing experience. I'm going to go through each setting with side-by-sides and what I'd personally recommend, but feel free to skip to this timecode shown on screen for my final recommendations without the extra detail. First up, when you boot up the game on Steam, you're asked to choose between Play Palworld and Play Palworld DX12, which is the game's way of showing you whether to play on the DX11 version or the DX12 version. These are just different graphics APIs with their own positives and negatives, but in my personal testing, I didn't see really any difference performance-wise, so I ended up choosing the base option, which is DX11. But my testing obviously didn't cover every case, so if you felt like switching to DX12, this option can be easily changed. Next up is the anti-aliasing / upscaling setting. Now we have four options here: none, FXAA, TAA, and TSR. What I'm sure you'll notice pretty quickly is that both FXAA and no anti-aliasing are pretty sharp and shimmery around the trees in the background. TAA is better, but can be seen as blurrier by a lot of people. There's an entire subreddit dedicated to hating this technology, so I'm not surprised. But if you pay attention to the FPS numbers, you'll see that TSR is beating the other three options by a pretty large margin. Now, this is the default setup that the developers recommend on this game, and honestly, I'm going to recommend it too. It's important to note that this is upscaling from an unnamed resolution. So you do get the problems that come along with that, like a general downgrade in image quality and potential artifacting in some situations, but it's what I would pick, considering that massive FPS uplift. Now onto view distance. Now visuals wise, I didn't really notice too much of a difference when switching between the four different options on the Steam Deck internal screen, but I did notice the frame rate dipping when you go from low to medium and above. So I'm going to recommend low here. Grass details is up next, and this one's a little bit more interesting. On the low setting, you don't get any of the grass strands across the environment, which leaves it to look pretty flat in comparison to the other three options. Medium brings in a lot more detail and adds a lot to the environment, but it also takes a lot away from that frame rate. I don't think the settings above medium even make sense on a device like this, so I'm going to choose low or medium, but it depends if you want that better visual quality or performance. Building drawing distance is another interesting one. At the default value of 100, even being this far away from the base, it's completely unloaded, except for the powers within it. I did find the default value to be a little bit distracting, as buildings would just unload immediately as soon as they pass a certain distance from the player. So personally, I would choose 300 for this, but dropping it will alleviate some of the strain on the CPU. Shadows is one of the most impactful settings in this game, and with low having basically non-existent shadows, I think upping it to medium is a bit of a no-brainer. If you want to go above that though, high does actually give you a little bit more range to these shadows, along with this nice ambient fog, but it does drop the FPS a little bit, so it's up to you, but I'd recommend medium. Okay, effects quality. Between the four options, I didn't really notice too much of a visual effects difference. That is, besides the additional detail of water bodies. So I decided to pick medium purely for this. Plus, it doesn't take away too much from the frame rate. The texture quality setting doesn't only control the resolution of textures, but also the anisotropic filtering. And because this game isn't actually using too much RAM or VRAM on the default setting, I think upping it to high is another no-brainer option. So if we put all of those settings together, this is what we get. And I think it looks much better. Yes, there is a reduction in frame rate, but I think the visuals make up for it. Plus, I would personally just cap this at 40 FPS and play like that. That would be my preferred experience. And if you want to copy the settings, here they are. Okay, now we're going to mess around with FSR4 and frame generation if you're into that. Starting off with pure FSR4, specifically the community version 4.0.2c, not the newer FSR 4.1.1 mod, which I couldn't get working with the Decky FrameGen plugin. So just keep in mind the newer version will perform better. This is FSR4 at its performance setting, and it's pushing the deck pretty hard, especially compared to TSR. However, if you cap it at 30 FPS, frame times do smooth out quite a bit. And out of curiosity, I did also throw on FSR3 frame generation while also using FSR4 for upscaling, both done through OptiScaler. I've also locked the GPU clock, which provides a better experience and is often recommended with FrameGen on the deck. With this, we can actually hit 60 FPS, although when I was recording this, I did notice the heavy input latency. I don't play games with frame generation myself, but if I were to choose, I'd typically pick the in-game options as they have access to motion vectors, heavily reducing artifacts, which is by far the worst part of something external like lossless scaling. And speaking of lossless scaling, here it is in its performance setting. In terms of visual smoothness, this is a lot better than FSR3FG. However, like I mentioned before, you'll see some pretty weird artifacts popping up, particularly when accessing the UI or turning the camera. But if you like using lossless, rest assured it'll work great here if you can ignore these things. Before we finish up, do I think the game deserves its verified status? Honestly, I actually think it's in a pretty decent position compared to a lot of other experiences on deck. Slowdowns can occur, as you've seen with bigger bases, but I think general playability is solid. Anyways, that's all for this video. Thank you all for watching as always. I'm planning on covering Palworld on the PS5 against the Pro next, as I'm actually kind of curious to see if the jump is worth it. Bye!